thank you very much for the assistance. Thank you very much for the organization and invitation to this nice conference and to the speakers before me. So I have to say that I'm going to talk about few things that people before me talk way better than I'm going to do. So I'm going to probably just skip them a little bit. But repetita iuvant, as we say, so maybe saying the same things some more times can help. So basically, we're gonna take 4 steps, starting from basic feeding behaviors and digestive physiology of horses, and going towards what can be one of the drivers of dysbiosis. And then following equine gut microbiome, I'm very happy Professor before me talked about that, so we don't have to go a lot into that. And then touching what could be a driver of GI diseases and just touching a couple of diseases as well. So this is very intuitive, but this is very basic and important, at least to us. So we do know that horses were evolved in the way of grazing for most of their times and moving through pastures. That means that half more or less percent of their time is supposed to be eating, and they're not used to be stable and standing inattently, right? So there is a mix of physiological factors affecting the fact that they are not gonna graze during the day, but they're gonna stand and they're gonna eat when they're fed, right? So this poses us in a normal condition, or at least let's say physiological condition, because we know that normally in stables we have a second kind of management, which is the meal feeding management. So physiologically, we do have a horse, we do have an animal that is evolved with the idea of eating for 12, 14, 16 hours a day. That means that it's gonna have a continuous fiber intake, low continuous fiber intake, low bulking activities, but a continuous fermentation. As we do know, the horse is it's called in Italian would be fermentatore caudale. I don't know honestly the transcription in English, but I think Spanish is really similar, so it's understandable. It means that it ferments in the backgut, right? So what goes there is gonna be constantly fermented, which is very different from what is nowadays, most nowadays, way of managing the horse, where we do have, because of logistic reasons, meal feeding. When we are lucky, we have 3 feedings. When we are unlucky, we have 2 or 1 feeding, bigger feeds and smaller timings of the day. So we do have reduced sewing. Of course, a lot of people have been speaking about that before me. Reduced sewing means less buffer activity of the saliva, but we do know that the horse continually secrete hydrochloric acid. So we do have on one side the buffer that is not always produced because the horse has meal feeding and non-continuous intake. On the other side, we do have continuous production of hydrochloric acid, which is not always bad, but that can be an issue, and that can halt the fermentation. Okay, so on one side, as I said before, we do have continuous grazing, continuous fiber intake, and gut fermentation, which allows us to have a stable and diverse microbial ecosystem. On the other side, and I'm not meaning to say that it's completely wrong, I'm just saying that it's different from what it's supposed to be from the very beginning. We have meal feeding, which potentially, as everybody's been saying and now, which is totally true, and I do share with that, potentially can have a starch overload. We do know that 1 grams per kilo of body weight a meal, 2 grams kilo per body weight a day. It's the maximum digestibility intake of a horse in starch. That can, if of course overpassed, have some fermentation disruption, which can be the reason why is not always, but can be, okay, is not strictly related, but an event and a cause of dysbiosis. Now, I don't want to prolong myself, but we do know that the horse eats a lot of NSC, which is non-structural carbohydrates, because of whatever reason we want to give them, so logistic or sporting reasons. We do know that the horse is unluckily one of the worst animals in having the chance to digest the starch, actually, because a little bit of amylase is actually secreted also in the stomach, and mainly we know it's secreted in the small intestine in the small intestine. So we do have amylase, we digest the starch, and some starch is going to be digested there, some other is not going to be digested there because it's too much. Also, because basically different kinds of starch, different kinds of digestibility, because it's the relationship between 2 kinds of granules of starch inside of it, and also because of technicalities of the starch way, of the way of proposing the starch. Let's say flaking, let's say cooking, let's say extrusion. Okay, so basically we do know that if we don't treat the starch, we're gonna have some basic digestibility, which is called pre-cycle digestibility. That means if I give, just to give some rough examples, if I give 1 kilo of maize, which is corn, and keeping in mind that my horse is a 500 kilo horse, which can get for a meal 500 grams of starch, for a day 1,000 grams of starch, and more or less, let's say, averaging 620 grams of starch for 1 kilo of maize, 550 for barley, and for 30 for oats. As I'm saying, these are general numbers, okay? It can change from some points of percentages. Let's consider the fact that I'm giving just 1 kilo. So as I said, the pre-cycle digestibility limits my ability of digest, considering that I'm under potentially 500 grams of starch. So I can digest up to 500 grams of starch a meal, but my corn is going to be able to be digested just up to 403 grams. The rest of them is going to be escaping and it's going to be going in the large intestine. Okay, we do know what's happening in the large intestine, so we do have the microbiota that ferments stuff and gives acetic acid, propionic acid, butyric acid, valeric acid, a bunch of acids, which most of them are good, some of them are not. The ideal is the balance between them, right? So I'm very lucky to work with a group of high professionals that have been doing this kind of works for quite some time now, and this is 3 of their studies where they tested what I'm telling you about. So basically, if you give a lot of starch, putting together the fact that the host cannot digest more than what we said before, so 1 or 2 grams per kilo of body weight a day, and we do have an incomplete pre-cycle digestions, we do have some starch that flows into the large intestine where it's gonna be fermented, the pH is gonna go down, and we're gonna have all kinds of potentially diseases, but started from dysbiosis. Dysbiosis is basically the fact that the balance of the microbiota is lost. Okay, and we do have different kinds of bacteria coming in, different percentages, but we're gonna see in a few slides. So what they do, this is the summary of these previous 3 slides, studies. What they did was put together a good herd of meat horses, and they followed them for 4 months in a dietary trial. And what they did, they separate them into groups. One was the high fiber diet. And as you can see here, the starch is under the limits that we said before, so under 2 grams per kilo of body weight a day. And the high starch diet was a little bit more than 5 times the high fiber diet. Okay, so a lot more. And in this picture, you can see where the X's are. This is the place where they did biopsies. They did that after postmortem, basically, after the slaughterhouse, and they sampled these parts of large and small and gastric parts in order to assess different kinds of parameters, which are a little bit summarized here. It's not all of them, so if you guys really like this subject, you should go and read the papers. But this is just for the point of our presentation today. So you do have on the lines the forage diet on the upper and the corn and starchy diet on the lower. You do have in the first column the microbiota, then you have fermentation parameters, and then you have fecal particle size, which is practically what we see in the physical size of feces. So it's pretty easy to understand here. We do have a different selection of the microbiota, which is expected. What we do see is the fibrobacter goes down, of course, because we have less fiber, so less bacteria prone to digest the fiber. And we do have an increase of streptococcus, lactobacillus, protobacteria, which are the bacteria that normally would digest starch and also would be more available to develop in an acidic environment. All right. That means that these bacteria are changing, the products of the bacteria are changing as well. So the volatile fatty acids that normally we do see in a low starch, high fiber diet are mainly around 60 to 70% in acetate. So mainly we have more acetate than the others. Then we have a little bit of propionate, which is the production of starch, but we don't have any valerate. All right. This is something I want you guys to keep in mind because we're going to see in the next slide something pretty cool about that. What they saw in the starchy diets is basically that, first of all, the volatile fatty acids increase as total concentration. So they did produce more gas. Okay, so this is something you want to keep in mind. More gas, more starch, more gas. Okay, gaseous colics can be something we need to think about. But they did also see a lot of increase of valerate from 0 to 40%. All right. From a practical and physical point of view, so talking about fecal particle size, you know that when you take out the feces and you separate them with sieves, you can detect which kind of particles your feces are made of. And generally, when talking about fiber diets, we see bigger fecal particle size, which is expected because the fiber gives bigger pieces, basically. And when we saw the starch diets, we saw smaller fecal particle size, which also related to the fact that they had a higher dry matter content in the left column. Okay, this is statistically relevant. So in all the horses, there were a higher concentration of dry matter in the left column. So that's another thing that we can keep in mind. So high starch can be something to do with constipation, maybe. All right. Let me go further. So this just a graphical representation because pictures most of the times works best than words. This is like we can describe and depict the microbiome of these horses. On the left, under letter B, you see the starchy horses. You can see that it's pretty easy to understand. We have way less different bacteria, all right, as a difference between species. Okay, so this is defined by the alpha diversity or Shannon index. That means that the most kind of bacteria you have inside the healthy is the host. So a normal Shannon index on a high fiber diet would be around 8 or something like that. These horses under the B, so the starchy one, had a Shannon index around 3. Okay, just to give you some reference ideas. And this is when I told you that I wanted you to keep in mind valerate. So these are the actual pictures from the study from my colleagues, and I have to thank them for giving that to me. On the lower parts of the pictures, you can see the same tract of intestine, small intestine between two different horses, one on starch diet, one on fiber diets. The first thing that comes to mind is the hyperemic mucosa. Okay, so that's inflammation, that's systemic and local inflammation that can give leaky gut syndrome, this kind of diseases where the toxics basically pass through the wall. And in another study, they also did that. So they checked the markers of leaky gut syndrome, which were positive. And I wanted you guys to keep valerate in mind because on the left upper side, this is a gastric ulcer. And valerate is statistically related with the presence of gastric ulcers. Okay, so keep in mind that dysbiosis and this microbism can be in the last part of the intestine, but this doesn't mean that things can go on the higher sides and fermentation can be also shared. This fermentation can be shared somehow. Alrighty. So this is all good. The science is always good and it's always fancy, but as professor before me said, microbiome is increasing nowadays and everybody's talking about it, which is really cool and it's really fascinating to me as well. What everybody's struck with though is the understanding of the results of a microbiome, basically. So the more we talk with people that have been doing that for all their life, the more I understand that we don't know a lot about the clinical interpretation of things. And this is a really, really nice editorial, which I suggest you guys to read from Michael Lewitson from the Royal Veterinary College. He's a diplomat in internal medicine, which has a passion in GI diseases. And basically, what he says is some basic but really important things, just to keep ground with everybody. Of course, the equine gastrointestinal tract has a really complex microbiome ecosystem, and that can be influenced by a bunch of things. We know that. We know that we can have the diet, the management, the drugs, the health, the age, bunch of things all together. So being that complicated, being influenced by that many things is not easy to understand when we see a microbiome results, right? What Mike says basically is what helps me to read my results from microbiomes that I suggest to clients is the fact that there are two things that you need to keep in mind. Alpha diversity. So the wider the Shannon index is, the most healthy the microbiome supposedly is. Because he has the chance to digest different kinds of substrates. So not just starch, not just fiber, but all the kinds in between. On the other side, there are some kinds of bacteria that gets developed when the environment is not healthy. And these are particularly actinobacteria like Escherichia coli, Salmonella, Klebsiella, things that we don't want to see or we want to see in really, really low quantities. So these two things are the practical things to take away, in my opinion and in Mike's opinion, from microbiome at the moment, from a clinical perspective at least, so not research-wise. Now, this is all good and this is all fancy, but do we have a relation between dietary change and potential gastrointestinal disease? Yes, we've seen that. We've seen that step by step. If I do change my diet in a way that is not supposed to be changed, the microbiome can actually be changing just because it's going to adapt to the feed I'm going to give. It's going to change the products of the fermentation of the bacteria that are changing as well. The microbiome itself is going to lose stability, and so I'm going to have some dysbiosis. Dysbiosis can lead, can increment, can increase, and can not help me to prevent or treat potentially gastrointestinal diseases. Right? So today, because of time's sakes, we're gonna talk just about two. It's gonna be some things about EBD and some brief introduction about colic, and I don't want to lose too much time on that. So I really do like IBD, to be honest, and all of these things can be found or can be followed if you guys want this year at ACFIM 2026 when I'm going to be talking about the nutritional management of equine EBD. The issue with that, with EBD in general, is that EBD is so complicated because it's basically a mixed group of inflammatory disorders of the intestine. Okay, so it's not easy to understand what we are seeing because when you see a horse with chronic intestinal inflammation, some malabsorption, so it can be a thin horse with different clinical presentation with diarrhea on one side, some other have recurrent colic, some other have just poor performance and don't have diarrhea. Some of them are just weight loss. So they don't need to have all of these things together. Okay, most of the time it's just few of them. It's really difficult to understand. First of all, if it's IBD. That's why IBD, it's basically a clinical combination of suspicion. There is a right part of exclusion of other diseases, and then there is some lab that can support us. And just quickly, we do rely, of course, on hematobiochemistry, mainly proteins, albumin, these kind of things. The next step normally is ultrasonogram of the small intestine. We want to see the thickening of the small intestine layer. So we don't want to see the thickening because thickened could be IBD. Then normally we do glucose or xylose. It's even better. Absorption test. So since the glucose is of course influenced by the insulin response of the host, xylose can be more interesting to understand if the absorption is partially or totally neglected. And the gold standard, which is of course biopsy, which is tricky, which is complicated because of course biopsy of small intestine needs to be done in gastroscopy and it's not a full thickness. On the pictures that you see here, this is what we do in our clinic here. Our surgeon, which is a really experienced surgeon, does just standing laparoscopy, small intestine biopsy, so that allows us to have a full thickness biopsy, and then we do have board certified pathologists that can do some really good diagnosis. So the system works pretty well. And then on the field, one of the most done thing, of course, is the rectal biopsy, which is understandably the only thing it could be done on the field, unless, of course, you can do a gastroscopy. But rectal has been proven to be debatable accurate when managing the diagnosis of IBD. So, as I said before, it's a complicated disease. The diagnosis is complicated, and there's a lot of things and factors affecting basically the diagnosis, also money-wise, because none of these are particularly cheap, to be honest. So if we need to give some basic rules for all the horses with IBD, we would structure that in 5 points. And they can be summarized as a pragmatic and avoidance-based diets. What does it mean? We're gonna see in a few slides actually. The first rules that everybody needs to keep in mind is that we always need to follow requirements, right? NFC, INRA, depending on what you guys want to use. But basically, keep please that in mind. Forage first. We know that the 3 pillars of horses are forage, freedom, and so basically forage first is the bait rule. So we do want to arrive to a 2% of body weight in dry matter. That means that if we do have hay, it's 10 kilos of 100 kilos horse. If we do have silage or haylage, of course, it's 17, 18 kilos. If we have grass, it's way more. So always consider the fact that it's based on dry matter. And from a experience point of view, we do not suggest more than 30% in alfalfa because of the reason the professors before me talked about. Starch, everybody's been hearing about starch. We've been talking about starch all the evening, of course, and it's not just the content, it's also the digestibility. Extrusion seems to play a big role in IBD because it improves pre-cecal digestibility. So we do tend to suggest extruded diets. There is some people talking about the fact that extrusion gives some, is called AGEs. These are products of the Maillard reaction of amino acids. And it's been proven in humans and in small animals that can be some negative effects on inflammatory state of the intestine. So that's up for debate. Okay, but basically what we do is do suggest extrusion. Maybe in the future we will not, but at the moment we do. The third one is fat, in order to avoid the use of starch. Okay, most of them are not competing horses. So, and even if they are, we can balance the diets in order to have enough energy through starch. Starch is a little bit tricky sometimes to use because some horses don't like more than 3 to 400 grams. Always keep in mind that 0.7 grams per kilo of body weight is the maximum limit. But that goes also with the inclusion of appropriate supplements, which we're going to talk in the point 5 in just a second. Before that, protein intake is really important, all right? So most of the times horses have a malabsorption, which means that the small intestine, which is the place where they're supposed to absorb protein through amino acids, is not working properly, right? So we don't want to overburden the small intestine as well. We don't want to give too much protein, which is not going to be digested and then goes into the large intestine. But at the other time, we do want to give enough for them to be absorbed, even if they cannot absorb properly, if that makes sense. So these requirements are basically requirements for sporting horses, more or less. There are a couple of papers talking about 2 grams per kilo of body weight. And we do suggest to avoid novel proteins, so don't keep the fancy feed that you never tried for your horse in this kind of cases. And last but not least, supplements, which do not make the diet but helps in improving them. Specifically, if you use a lot of fats, always keep in mind that vitamin E in its natural form, which is always the best because of bioavailability, which is RRR alpha tocopherol, needs to be included at least 1 to 1.5 international units per milliliter of added oil, which means that just doing some random math, if you have a horse with 500 kilos, you need to give at least 1 unit per kilo of body weight, so 500 units a day, which means that if you have some malabsorption, you want to increase that by X factor, which is more or less 2. And then you want to add, if you have 300 milliliters of oil, other 300 units up to 450. So let's say that the safe limit would be 1,500 more or less. And we can get up to 5,000 depending on the clinical condition. So pretty high numbers of vitamin E as well. Now, this is a tricky thing, which I wanted to talk to you guys about because everybody's been talking about that in IBD. It's gluten. We all know that gluten has a huge role in human IBD. So everybody's been asking, does it all have the same role in equine? We don't know. This is one of the things that we normally do into research. We don't know the results of it. We don't know if we need to cut it completely. There are a few studies, 3 in total. The first one, which is the one that everybody been freaking about and still freaks about, is the fact that there is a possible gluten-related immunity reactivity in some of the horses taken into study with IBD. There's been a study in between where they were trying to check if there is the same celiac-like mechanism from a immunitary point of view, which could not be demonstrated. And last, from the group of the guys from Ghent Internal Medicine, they did depict a mixed picture. So some horses did improve when they avoided the use of gluten. So there seems to be some clinical reason to avoid gluten, but IBD needs to be confirmed, and it doesn't mean that all IBD horses will improve without gluten. So since it's a really complicated disease, we do not think that one diet fits all. So in our clinics, we do tend to differentiate horses based on the manifestation of disease. The first one, and the most basic and most recurrent, I would say, is the chronic weight loss. What you want to do is basically avoid the fact that the horse is losing because it has malabsorption. So you want to maximize the digestibility of the forages. What you can do is to change the whey, or at least include some percentages of different kinds of hay. And I'm talking about pelleted days, chaffs, waffers, whichever you guys want, whichever the guys like, because not all the horses like all the pellets. The oil can be added gradually in time, slowly. Some horses do not appreciate more than 300 grams. I learned that it does depend also from the geographic place of the horse. I've seen that in Belgium. I don't know why they don't like the oil. In Italy, they do. Maybe it's because we do oil in different way, but still, that's a thing. And we do like to give them frequent meals because they having this kind of malabsorption. The bigger meal you give, the less absorption you can get, and lots of it is going to be lost, physically lost, just passing through. So you want to avoid that and cut it in multiple meals. The second one is recurrent colic. Recurrent colic normally would be because you do have a thickening of the small intestine, so there is a physical obstruction or partially physical obstruction to the long stem hay or to the feet in general, depending on the graveness of the disease. And so what you want to do, you want to give something fully soaked, so it's liquid, so it passes through, and that's why you want to give a lot of meals as well, right? 8 to 10, because you need to decrease the load, the bulking activity, so you want them to pass easily. In these cases, we do want to, and we suggest to avoid completely concentrates, right? Because concentrates can, because the difficulty of passing through the small intestine, be stuck in the stomach. And when they're stuck in the stomach, it's not going to be very fancy because they're going to ferment, and you don't want gastric ulcers with that. And one thing which is really practical but really useful, lots of people, when you suggest to give a lot of fully soaked meals, they tend to use mashes. Mashes are cool, mashes are good, but a lot of mashes are made with beet pulp. Everybody knows that beet pulp tend to soak a lot of water. So if you give a lot of beet pulp, you're gonna go in the opposite direction because it's not gonna be easier for them to pass. It's just gonna be bigger, right, in the small intestine. So it's gonna be an issue. The third one is the complication of this. So basically, because of what I said before, so when you have everything stuck into the stomach, you can have what is called secondary gastric disease. So it's not because the ambient, the environment into the stomach is not per se safe, but it's just because the small intestine does allow the stomach to drain. So it's gonna start to ferment, and it's gonna give you gastric ulcers. So you want to use the same of recurrent colic. Just keep in mind that fully soaked forage could be alfalfa and it could be a wafer. So that could help you with the buffering activity of the chewing and also because of the protein and the calcium going inside the stomach. So soaking all the acids and diluting with the water. So that helps a lot. And consider that the oil inclusion that you could put inside before, because maybe the horse was a little bit thin as well, could delay the emptying of the stomach. So you don't want to put too much oil because oil takes more time to pass. Unless you want to use a medium chain triglyceride, which is coconut oil, which is tendentially faster and it doesn't, it's not generally a problem with that matter at least. And the last one, which is the nightmare of every internal medicine and nutritionist as well, it's when the horse adjusts poor performance. So basically, it's an EBD, but it's a mild EBD, but the horse does not perform well, but still needs to perform, right? So he needs to sustain his requirements. You cannot, most of the times, avoid the use of starch. It's not really realistic. But you can reduce it and you can switch. So that's a good spot in nutrition you should do. Switch the kind of energy and improve the kind of use of fiber and include some kinds of fats. So this is our opinion, is the way we would suggest to divide, and we do suggest and we use that to divide nutrition in IBD colics. So final take on IBD, and I'm gonna pass through. What we want to do is be flexible. We want to be able to change our mind because the pathology is a chronic pathology. Long term is going to change. We want to reassess the horse over time. We want to visit the horse over time because things can change. And we'll be having horses starting with a serious EBD with a recurrent colic and gastric disease. And now they're winning some 160 in jumping. So things can improve, but it takes time. We do want to have three principal parameters. First one, reduce luminous stressors. We do have to remember that is an inflammation, right? So we do want to prefer something that is always digestible as a forage, and we want to minimize also the quick change. So always try to have your change into 20 days, 15 days, depending on how much you're going to change. You want to maintain adequacy. Remember that the horse is not absorbing and digesting what is supposed to be. So you need to meet and most of the time exceed energy, protein, and vitamin requirements. Okay. And then what we do suggest is to adjust, considering that different phenotypes require different kinds of strategies. So the compromise is always behind the corner and is good. Okay. It's not always bad. Last topic. It's the dysbiosis and colic. Okay, this is a big topic, and I don't want to make it too easy, because it's really complicated. But I'm gonna tackle it just from the sides of col on dysbiosis. Everybody knows, I don't need to report that. But horses, even if they are the best managed, the best nutrition, the healthiest, can go into colic because of different reasons, anatomical conformations, bunch of things, management system, age groups, and basically we do have a lot of incidents of colics. So why don't we try to avoid the incidence of colics? All right. And we can, nutritionists do that because we do know it's a matter of fact, and all of this information, if you guys want, you can find in the paper cited below, which is a review, scoping review that we just published last month. All of these things all together bring a disbalance in the dysbiosis. So basically, starting from the prolonged fasting, as we were saying in the very beginning on this talk, we do have a reduced gut motility, which means the feed is going to stay more into the same place, which is going to ferment more, and which is going to give some fermentation imbalance. So bacteria are going to change and they're going to have more gases, different kind of gases. And the same goes with the high starch, so NSC, non-structural carbohydrates, which, as we said before, is the sum between starch and VSC, which is water-soluble sugars, so basically sugars and starch, or large meals as well. Basically, if you give too much, either in just starch or even in just completing the dietary composition and everything, you do have an incomplete digestions, which can give us overflow. This is the same as protein as well, right? Starch is the most interesting because it's really easy to understand and is really important, but protein goes the same way basically. And you do have different kinds of fermentation patterns with pH drops, leaky guts, as we saw before, and all brings to in-gut dysbiosis. Also, management. Okay, so nutrition does not go just by what you feed, but is also how you feed. If you don't have an holistic view on the management of things, you're gonna lose half of the picture. So abrupt dietary change, and what abrupt means to me, if everything that is not changed following the rule of 3-3-3, 3-3-3 would means 3 days, 3 days, and 3 days, and each 3 days you're gonna change 1/3 of the percentage, so 25 and 75% of the old one, 50% of the new one, 50% of the old one, and the opposite 75 and 25. Whichever moment the horse does give some sign of instability, which is diarrhea, which is gassy colics, you need to stop and give some extra days for the microbiome to adapt. Because if you don't do that, there is a higher chance of microbial instability. And this is the same thinking about leaving a horse on the pasture after a winter, right? It really makes sense if you think this way. And the last one, which is not exactly preventing, but at this point we're also considering about managing and fixing, whichever kind of GI disease we do have, and we don't feed as soon as we clinically can, we have some nutrient deprivation which cannot help our mucosa to recovery. And we're gonna have, of course, some microbial instability, and also we're gonna increase the possibility to have some leaky gut diseases. So I think it's safe to say that in colics we can talk about protective nutrition strategies in colic-prone horses or just in any horses, and also strategies to fix when the colics actually happen. So this is just basic stuff on what we do suggest in order to avoid the incidence in colic-prone horses. So of course, forage is always first. As you can see here, the intake is a little bit lower because this is the minimum requirements of a horse which is healthy. Before I was suggesting 2%, which is of course always suggested because we do know that horses with malabsorption tend to lose more weight. Low NSC, as you can see here, the intake it's even lower. These are the requirements also suggested for EMS, so metabolic diseases, which is basically 1/3, so 0.3 a meal, one a day. The feeding pattern helps a lot. So avoid fasting more than 6 hours, which is always difficult in stables, of course. So use nettays if you guys can. Have some paddocks if you guys can. That's always good. Avoid abrupt dietary changes, which I talked about that. So 3-3-3 rule is always good. And one thing that helps a lot is to soak the feed. As the colleague was saying before, we don't know why people don't consider water in the pyramid of nutrients. Water is really important in all the digestibility processes. So soak the feeds, which is always easy. They drink in summer is fantastic. What we want to go towards, it's the stable fermentation, okay, which is achieved by continuous fiber intake and controlled. I'm not saying no starch, I'm saying controlled starch exposure because we all know that we want to feed some starch to our horses to perform. But yeah, sometimes shit happens. Sorry for the word, but what if colic happens? Okay, everybody knows that this is the worst nightmare of vets and of owners as well. Now, it's really, really important to consider early enteral nutrition when it is clinically deteriorated. What does this mean? It means that if it does not have ileus, if it does not have gastric reflux, it's good to start thinking about including diets, enterally diets. We do suggest to go parenteral nutrition just after 72 hours, if it's allowed and if the money allows that, because it's really expensive, at least in Italy. Start with small amounts of forage. We're going to talk about the amounts in the next slide to give some numbers. And we do prefer to have highly digestible fiber sources, which means pelleted or wafers, these kind of things. We don't want starch at all during recovery for 14 days. And the intake needs to be gradually. What does gradually means? So this it's the graphical representation, what you guys can find in the review. So just to give some numbers, this is based on a horse of 500 kilos. And the first 2 days, as you can see, is suggested to be just forage. So green is forage and blue is total dry matter, which does not mean that you guys can avoid giving forage afterwards, but you can include something to balance out the diet from an energetic and vitamin point of view. So what you guys want to do is to increase progressively based on body weight. Everything needs to be soaked, in our opinion at least. And as you can see here, by day 6, the idea would be 1% in dry matter, okay? Total dry matter, so we're not just thinking about forage at this point. Ideally, in 14 days, we would like to be back on business, all right? This is the ideal situation in a colic, whichever is medical or surgical, okay? This is developed on case lots of surgical colics from a paper of 2019, and then the last parts touched by us from last year's works. So what I like to point out, if I can leave you guys with some messages in that, in the opinion nowadays in science, the horse, which is a continuous fermenter, basically relies on the fact that whichever thing we do that do not allow him to be onto stable fermentation patterns can help the risk of having issues. Okay. Clinical nutrition has the role to help internal medicine in order to maintain and to restore, when it's possible, after diseases, the microbial stability of the large intestine and to avoid the insurgency of diseases, gastrointestinal diseases. With this, I leave you to the references, which you guys can take a look here, which is not particularly fancy. And I'm gonna thank you everybody for allowing me to talk about this cool topic this night for me. And I'm really happy to take any questions you guys may have. Thank you.